Hi, it's Chris Dixon. This is the a16z podcast. I'm here with Peter Rubin from Wired Magazine, who has spent a lot of time studying virtual reality and augmented reality. So we're going to talk about that today. One of my favorite topics. So Peter, thanks for being here. Let's just like the broad landscape, like what's going on now. So there's obviously Oculus, Microsoft's HoloLens, Magic Leap. Like, what's your impression of what's happening?
Well, right now it seems like last year and continuing into this year, what's interesting about it is there have always been kind of these tertiary players in the market and like smaller companies. But what's happening now is the titans are kind of by proxy drawing these lines in the sand. So Facebook kind of sided with VR for Oculus. Microsoft made its bet with augmented reality, and we can talk more about that difference. And then Google went from kind of one mode of AR thinking with Google Glass to not necessarily scrapping that, but they're rethinking what they're doing there internally. And instead, last year there was that $500 million that went to Magic Leap, which is kind of an AR startup based in South Florida. So we don't know what Amazon is doing. We know that Apple is filing some patents and hiring VR engineers. So there's certainly a lot of motion in the space. Sony's got Project Morpheus for kind of the console specific play. Yeah.
So how do you think about VR versus AR? Like, what are the different, first of all, like, which do you think will happen sooner? How optimistic are you about each? What are the different use cases?
I was, it's interesting. I think people saw a usable case of AR first, popularly speaking, when Nintendo 3DS came out. That was kind of a really lo-fi version, and it gave people a sense of what was possible.
It felt like the games that came with it with the cards. Like those were really cool, but there wasn't a ton of follow-up as far as I remember.
And I think this is the case with a lot of what Nintendo does. Developers don't necessarily take advantage of the functionality.
It's all first-party Nintendo stuff. Yeah.
Right, so they had these cool cards that came with the 3DS that when you looked through, the 3DS had kind of this front-facing camera, and it would bring characters to life out of the table.
It was pretty awesome.
It was.
The 3D effect too was surprisingly good.
Yeah, it was really, really well done. And so I think that AR was almost in the ether just a little bit earlier. And certainly, Oculus caught fire, and you know the story well in 2012. So we've had a couple of years now to get used to it. But after, I've spent a lot of time, with a bunch of different companies talking about this and thinking about this, and VR is going to be, is first to market already. I mean, with the Samsung Gear VR that came out in December, we have a consumer product for sale. That's a big leap to make. And then certainly I think that more of the technical problems have been solved for virtual reality rather than augmented reality. And just to...
Well, specifically, I think to me at least, the big bottleneck with AR is to do it well. For most applications, you're going to need very good machine vision.
Right.
Because you don't want, if you have the real world there, you want to have the virtual overlay interact with the real world. And to do that, you have to understand the real world. And to do that, my understanding from the technologists is that to do that in a very low latency kind of real-time way is far beyond the current capabilities.
Right.
Whereas VR, it works basically. Like if you've tried Crescent Bay, it's working, right?
Yeah, it's definitely working. And certainly, I haven't used Magic Leap. I've used a number of different kind of not quite consumer-ready AR technologies, but what I understand from people who have experienced Magic Leap and what they're working on there is it's going to take $500 million to make this real, to realize this. And so while they have kind of these prototype experiences, there's so much more to do, and there's so many more problems to be solved. And I think you're absolutely right. It's kind of exponentially more complex to layer artifice over the world that you actually see, whereas with VR, you have kind of the luxury of being able to pre-render everything that a person might see, at least in a CGI scenario, in a gaming scenario or something.
And especially the other thing too, I think, is the tool chain, kind of like the Unity and Unreal and all the different things you do to build VR has already been built up those are pretty powerful tools for the gaming world.
That's
and also
a great point.
All the talent and everything else is just sort of like, as soon as they get excited, you can shift it over pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, that's very true. And certainly since it was last March that the Facebook acquisition happened, but since then, the kind of quantum leap that happened at Oculus is all of a sudden, with that backing, they'd had multiple rounds of funding, as you well know, but after they had this vote of confidence from someone who clearly isn't going anywhere, all of a sudden the talent started coming. Like they had this very Spartan mentality, like we need 300 people who are the absolute best at what they do, and they just keep poaching and keep adding new people. And just today, we're recording this on a Monday, and at Sundance this morning they announced that Oculus Story Studio, which is this venture to develop CGI filmmaking, and they got Edward Sachi and they got Sascha Unseld from Pixar. So they're getting pretty incredible talent even outside the gaming space. Gaming was where they started, and so they were able to lay a lot of groundwork, and certainly with Unreal and Unity streamlining that process. The question now is, for me at least, what's going to happen in the realm of live action video, because there's so many problems that need to be solved there.
I also think, I'd be curious if you think it's right. My sort of framework for it is VR will be more about play, because it's a fully invented world. Whether I personally think it'll be less. I think games will be big, but I think it'll be a lot of like what's happening with the Hollywood stuff, kind of quote experiences. But they're completely new worlds, right? Whereas once you've introduced, like, once I'm looking AR, I'm looking at my office. Like, generally that is more for a work context, right? You're overlaying information. You're magically Googling everything you see, right? I think so. That's kind of my broad.
No, I think that's true, and certainly after the Wired story about HoloLens came out last week, I saw a couple of tweets of yours, and I think you nailed it there. That I think
I was debating with Startup L, like a fictional Twitter character.
I think that was you and Startup L Jackson, right? There were worse people to.
I think I have to reflect on my life when I am spending my afternoon tweeting with an imaginary person. But anyways,
worse people to debate with. But I think you're right. I think the enterprise applications for AR are the kind of driving thing right now, and certainly. Even players that aren't Google and aren't Magic Leap and aren't Microsoft recognize this. There are companies that their entire kind of raison d'etre is working on this instructional overlay, and certainly that's what our writer Jessie Hempel saw when she got hands on with the HoloLens, up at Microsoft. And you're right. I think absolutely that there's a recreational bent to VR, which isn't to say we're not going to have productivity suites in there, and you're not going to be able to teleconference, and you're not going to be able to have kind of you're going to have a virtual desktop display when resolution catches up to this, and we'll be able to kind of overhaul what we think of as workspace. But for the most part, I think that is a very easy divergence point of the two technologies.
So do we know, does Microsoft, they're going to pursue some kind of gaming thing with the HoloLens? It's part of their Xbox group, right? Or
it's hard to say, because since Nadella came in and took over from Ballmer, I think it's possible that the original roadmap has changed. In 2012, I think there was a kind of internal roadmap that leaked, and part of that was you saw people wearing these AR glasses, and they meant it to be part of the Xbox Entertainment Group. I think that's changed.
We'd heard about it because when we invested in Oculus, whatever it was, a year and a half ago, we did, we were sort of analyzing the competitors and had heard a bunch of rumors about that, but had heard it was a gaming, and heard it was very good, by the way. Like the best out there, outside of Oculus.
I think that's true. I mean, as different as the two are, but I think that I think that it may have started that way. But I would imagine that with what they're doing with every device stuff and what they're trying to do with Windows 10, I would imagine that HoloLens is going to be a more integral part of that than it was originally intended to be. Mm-hmm. So I would be surprised if they weren't trying to leverage their enterprise world. And
then Google, do we have any sense beyond like the cardboard stuff, and is there like going to be a serious effort, Magic Leap? As far
so cardboard is the kind of lowest of the low end of the VR solutions, but with Magic Leap, the way they talk about it, not the way Google talks about it, but the way Magic Leap talks about it, is they see it as this magical intersection of the two. And I think that we're probably inexorably going to move to this point where one device is going to be able to handle both, whether that's fully contained VR or switch, on some continuum to an AR overlay. But I think that I think that the two are different. I mean, cardboard came out of that 20% time thing, and they handed it out to developers at I/O, and they were like, see what you can do. And so Street View is cool, and people are doing some interesting things for such a kind of low processor solution. But I think that what Google sees in Magic Leap is something that's a lot more transformative than that.
So what do you think? So what's your prediction for the next couple of years in terms of, Oculus comes out, like, will it be a gaming device? Well,
it's going to be an entertainment device, right? I think we both know that. And I think that while they position themselves as gaming first. I think they're going to come out of the gate with a lot of non-gaming entertainment things, just like the Samsung Gear VR had. They commissioned a lot of 360-degree video. They commissioned a lot of other experiences, and certainly there are companies now that are cracking streaming VR experiences. So I think that we're looking at kind of a media viewer and a streaming viewer and a gaming device. So there are the developer community working in Oculus, even outside the kind of AAA houses that have their secret projects. The development community has been so fanatical, and the pipeline is so robust that there are already so many games that you can play just for a dev kit. I mean, Elite Dangerous.
Have you played like Blaze Rush, for example? Like,
I haven't played Blaze Rush.
Blaze Rush. So I was playing all weekend. I have one at home, and what's really surprised me is Lucky's Tale. Have you seen Lucky's Tale?
Oh yeah. Lucky's Tale's phenomenal.
So Blaze Rush and Lucky Tale, I think, are the two best games so far on the Oculus. And what's is surprising is they're both third person.
Yep.
And they're not the flashiest first person kind of now. And like Elite Dangerous is cool. I guess so I want to hesitate here because until you have incredibly good, like the top AAA game designers build stuff, I don't want to overgeneralize. Right. And like, have you seen the Crescent Bay demo?
Yeah.
Like the part where you're like in the street with the robots.
Showdown, that epic
with the slow motion bullets. Like that's when you see that, you're like, okay, those are the Gears. I think that's the Gears of War team. Like once you see like the pros make stuff, you're like, okay, maybe I have to reconsider.
Right.
Because prior to seeing that, I was like, first person's not going to work as well. Then I saw that, I'm like, okay, maybe now that I see the pros do it. But the thing about Blaze Rush though is it's a very boring game. And no offense to the Blaze Rush guys, if it's not Oculus. Like I played it on the screen. It's just like it's like you're watching cars from a third person go around the track. First person, it is amazing. Like I literally played it for 6 hours this weekend. Like the missiles, like things are blowing up. And by the way, we have the stereo headphones, and like the missiles like flying past your head, and like guys are like blowing up, and it's just like, and that's only one player. If you get two play, like it's really engaging, and there's no like nausea or anything else or like weirdness.
Well, the game design question, I think that if it's going to be first person, it either has to be slowed drastically to what kind of fast twitch games are, or you have to give the player a stable environment like a car chassis, right? That changes everything because all of a sudden you have this
car
frame.
Games are pretty good,
yeah,
or space like Elite Dangerous.
Exactly, because you're surrounded by something that's not going on.
Have you tried Radial G like that?
No,
it's like a kind of a racing one. It's good.
I think that we're going to see for first person, it's going to be a lot of exploration games. I think Jonathan Blow, who made Braid, has been working on this game, The Witness, for a long time, and it's this kind of it's a throwback to Myst and puzzle games like that. But it was not originally meant for VR, but he's working on it to play in the Rift, and I think that first person, you're going to need to slow things down. That's what made that epic demo in Crescent Bay so compelling, is they slowed it way down. It was bullet time. You could kind of move through it at your leisure. And what John Carmack has said in some tweets recently is he thinks it might be best if you just take control over yaw, kind of left to right swivel away from the player. Not left to right swivel, left to right strafing. Actual movement on.
Could be more like you're on rails, kind of like the old, like Dragon's Lair games or whatever, where you just sort of like have a few key decision points.
Yep, and what some other people are doing is rather than letting you. If you're using an Xbox controller, you can think of it as a PlayStation one if that's your preferred console, is if you're using that right thumbstick to swivel on the neck of the player. Some designers are using the shoulder buttons instead to click this and you'll instantaneously swivel 90 degrees. And what that does is the world doesn't spin around you. And as much as used to as you can be for first person experiences, having the entire 360 degree sphere that you're living in move around you is it's a profoundly disorienting thing. And so while I think you're right, I think we're going to have great first-person experiences. They need to be in the hands of people who have done some really, really deep thinking about what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. And we mentioned Lucky's Tale, which is amazing. And like that's one where I don't think it's publicly available right now. I'm not sure. It's sort of a Nintendo-esque, like Mario World-esque kind of thing.
There may be a demo available on Samsung.
The thing about that is like you bring non-gamers over and they try it, and like it has the kind of wonder of like the original Nintendo or something.
Oh yeah, that's
like everyone loves it. It's not a hardcore gamer experience.
That was my first reaction to it as well. I saw it. I guess it was last year at E3 they brought it, and I was like, yeah, third person, we'll see. And I put it on, and it takes you back. It is as kind of cartoonishly brilliant as those early Nintendo games, the first time you played Mario. The difference is they've done such good thinking about camera control and how to to ground a person in this game world without moving them around. You can control what you see, but it's done at such kind of gentle speeds that you're never going to get uncomfortable.
Feels like
in that
Nintendo,
game.
like they should. Nintendo should be all over this. Like if they. I don't know. I mean, they need something. They need a
totally
hook. And this, when you see Lucky's Tale, like this is how imagine like Super Smash Brothers and
oh my god,
how awesome it would be.
Oh my god, yeah. I mean, look, Nintendo made their play with NFC. The near field stuff with amiibos, which were kind of popular among dedicated gamers, but we've seen for well over a decade now they take 3 or 4 years to move on a technology that's already changing the landscape. So, if that's the direction they go, and Miyamoto has certainly cautioned us against thinking that they're doing this. I think they want to see how it plays out. They're so cautious about that stuff, and they're so reserved that it wouldn't surprise me if they go that way. AR didn't really pan out for them. But yeah, they've got the IP to really make that worthwhile.
What's so exciting to me now, like actually Paul Bettner, who's Lucky Tale, this came from him. He said it's like the beginning of film when the Lumiere brothers, like the train's coming at them and everyone thinks it's actually coming at them, or the example he gave is before they had the notion of an establishing shot in film. Establishing shot is like when you show the building outside and then you show. Before that, they would, if you watch like the old like Charlie Chaplin movies, they'd have like 10 minutes of just people going in and out of Grand Central Station. Like they didn't understand like the neuroscience, so to speak, of how the brain interprets film and creates a reality, right? And I think we're at that. That's what I'm quoting Paul here, but we're at that period now with VR, right? So people are just figuring out and it's going to be really, really interesting. Do you know Chris Milk?
Oh yeah, I was just about to bring him up because
the stuff he's working on is fascinating and doing music videos and other. Did you try the Beck thing?
I tried the Beck thing, and actually, it's funny that you say the Lumiere brothers. Just one of the experiences that he has at Sundance right now is this kind of abstract take on the train coming. The train pulling into the station it was the one that freaked out all the French audiences in like 1890s when they first saw it. But we're at the dawn of this new visual grammar, right? Filmmakers are trying to figure this out because no one's had to. We've been viewing movies through a frame for so long that we have no idea how to approach these. And then even beyond that, beyond the logic of like establishing shots and like you said, how people's brains interpret signals. If you're in a sphere of reality and you can look anywhere and action is going to unfold quite possibly in a different zone of that screen. What's going to cue you to be looking at the thing that's narratively most important to the movie experience? And I've seen some really interesting kind of papers and thinking from some groups who are trying to, at least for rendered movies, for CGI stuff, trying to create almost like a new code where zones will be highlighted in little kind of very subtle chimes
to control the attention.
Yeah, to control the attention. Just because we, when you're sitting in an IMAX theater, there's one thing you're going to be looking at, and even if you're looking at the upper left corner of the screen, something needs to happen at the lower right, you're going to know about it. This is very different. Something can happen behind you, and I think that, Oculus's move to pursue directional audio was a really smart one to make it an integrated part of their consumer solution. Because we got so used to putting on headphones, just stereo headphones or maybe even surround sound to play games in VR, but you're going to need something that's a half turn past that. You're going to need something that's truly calibrated to that environment. Have you
seen how Chris Milk does his recordings?
No.
No, he actually has a plastic human head with ears all around it. So it turns out like the reason that you know a sound is behind you is your brain is trained to know that when it hits like the shape of your ear will alter the sound. And so your brain knows if the sound sounds a certain way, it's to the right of you. If it sounds a different way, it's behind you because of the shape of your ear. So the only way to properly record 3D sound is to have basically a head with a bunch of ears on it. And then as you turn, then the sound turns appropriately. That's the way you trick your brain. So
that's fascinating. So I have a question for you, actually. I've been thinking a lot about this, and there are a lot of players entering this space, and I think that Oculus is happy about this, and there's room for everyone. But we have this spectrum that's emerged now, right? You have kind of low-end devices like Google Cardboard or any clamshell device that lets you basically plug a smartphone in if it doesn't have any onboard processing. And then you have kind of Samsung Gear VR, which is a little bit between the two. It has a little bit of onboard work that's being done, and then you have kind of full standalone peripheral that works with a dedicated computer. I would imagine we're gonna need standards at some point, right? We're gonna need something that is kind of certified VR. I was last week I was at this event in Miami, and I ended up meeting the guy who started the Meant to Be Seen forums, which was this message board for 3D and later VR, which is where Palmer and Carmack first connected.
Oh, great. Okay.
So he and I were talking, and he kind of made me see the light about this. He said, what is going to stop someone from claiming that a product is VR just because you can put on goggles, right? Because there's still a lot of consumer products out there that are basically just hanging a screen in front of your eyes and aren't delivering that transportive experience. So
I think it's a great. So I think to me, one of the big open questions is how good does a VR have to be for people to embrace it, right? So I think if you talk to like Brendan at Oculus, he's got a very, very high bar, arguably too high. Like he doesn't think, like to me, Crescent Bay, is clearly
it's ready to go.
It's ready to go, and he still wants to make it better. He's got a very, very high bar. Other people I talk to, I think Chris Milk is one, think we're all old people who grew up in the era of what he calls rectangle fetishism, when back when people stared at rectangles on the wall. And those people,
I love that.
I know, rectangle fetishists. So the rectangle fetishists believe that you've been so trained not to see this, but when the 6-year, you put a Samsung thing on a 6-year-old and they don't, they're off to the races.
Right,
it's
right.
like all, it's like they don't need much better. And of course they'll watch their movies in a virtual movie theater with their Samsung on. So they're sort of like what you might call like the VR maximalist view of like Brendan and the minimalist. And I don't know the answer. I mean, my instinct is more on the Brendan side. I think you need to make it really, really good, especially if people are going to use it for 6 hours or something. And like the DK2, I love it, but there's a screen door effect.
Oh, yeah.
There's the field of view, the refresh rate. There's issues, right? So I tend to think that, and therefore, as you can't really impose standards to say everyone has to make something just as awesome as Oculus, who's spending billions of dollars, right? So if you're a maximalist, it's hard to imagine standards emerging anytime soon, because it's going to be, a constant horse race. It'd be like back in the PC era in the 90s, saying everyone has to have a top tier Pentium. Like it's not realistic, right? So so that's a big question to me. Is like, what will how much of this is just that we grew up in the non VR era and expect the standards to be very high? How much is the other thing is interesting is like people talk about simulator sickness, and I think up until 2 years ago, everyone thought that had to do, people we talked to when we invested in Oculus, they all said it had to do with the latency, right? The latency in between it's motion to photon. Your head moves, and then your eye gets updated, right? And then it turns out basically like Oculus has now solved that. Like it's low enough, it's whatever it is, 10 milliseconds, it doesn't matter. And yet you generally don't get sick, but like you still get, like if a zombie jumps out from the right side of your, from behind you, you get scared, and potentially if enough of that happens, you get sick. So I think we've moved beyond the point where the sickness comes from technical issues. It now comes from the fact that your body feels like you're in a different world.
Oh yeah.
And people can do things to you in that world that have a strong emotional impact on you, right? So we sort of moved beyond, to my mind, the technical into the sort of the like you talked about standards. I think there's going to be more like standards, like you can't have zombies just jump out on people. Like, almost like that's like the whatever the federal department that regulates VR says. You know what I mean?
It's the may cause seizures of VR gaming.
To me, there's two. So to answer your question, there's sort of two levels, right? There's the technical level of what do you need minimally to convince people and not have simulator sickness, and then there's what are the rules of the content in that world? Because your body, it's a different feeling than seeing something on the screen.
Yeah, game design best practices is going to be a huge part of this, and I think one of the best things to come out of Epic's kind of close partnership with Oculus throughout their entire development process is they're really up there at the front lines figuring out what works and what doesn't. They created, the vast majority of those early demos through DK1, DK2, and like you said, they did that kind of pièce de résistance on Crescent Bay. And so every AAA studio has them and is working with it, but there are going to be, I think, maybe categories. And we see this now. If you put on your Samsung and you go to the store, you see most people will be comfortable. Uncomfortable for some, uncomfortable for many. And it's this very squishy scale, but it's based on how dynamic is the action, how much does your perspective move around the world. And I think that that actually maybe is a clue to how we're going to see this evolve. Is there maybe there's just going to be a scale of probably not 1 to 10, but I would imagine it's on a G through NC-17 type of hierarchy, right? Where only the most
like a rating,
battle-hardened, Call of Duty heads will be able to handle something. And I'm a big believer in the idea that those experiences should be available to those who want them, should a studio be willing to invest in that.
The 12-year-old is going to be like, turn it up,
yeah, turn it up,
faster, more violent.
But think about
like the kids playing like this.
You think about those kind
tournaments.
Think about the kind of the sniper montages you see of kids running around a Call of Duty map, no scoping everyone and doing a 360 turn in between, and it's dizzying to watch in YouTube. Imagine playing, and that's how they're going to want to do it. But
like turn it up, make it turn it
more up. It's terrifying.
It's going to be awesome. So on the developer side, so we have, if you go on the Reddit forums or an Oculus Share, there's tons of kind of indie excitement. I think Oculus has a few partnerships, but what are you seeing in terms of like is why? I guess the question I have is, why isn't EA and Activision, all these guys going heavy into it, or do you think they will at some point?
I think they are.
Wait and see.
I think they have. Okay. I think that I think that there's some value maybe for a studio at least in waiting for those specs to get a little more firmly entrenched. I don't know if Crescent.
Do you think it's just the specs, the input, things like that?
Yeah, I think
it's to the risk, the market risk.
I think a lot of people, like a lot of prospective employees, were swayed by the acquisition last year. I think that
it's interesting. Like you say that because we live in a different world where startups are able, like, the game world's different than the venture capital startup world, and it's funny because we like, for example, Michael Abrish. I actually flew up to Seattle a couple weeks before the Facebook acquisition because we were trying to recruit him for so long. And then once Facebook happened, I think it was the day after, literally. In the game world, you're right. Like, they don't believe in kind of startup equity as much, and like Facebook coming in with like cold hard cash,
that's real to them,
made a big difference in the developer world.
But also, I mean, that the way the gaming ecosystem has changed is there's this huge middle ground that used to exist and no longer does, right? So you have all these really small, vibrant indie games, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you have
it's the very indie and the very big.
Very indie and very big. So what I don't think we're going to see in the early years are very big. We're not going to see Destiny done for VR. We're not going to see EA buy in at $100 million level. Yeah. I think what we are going to see quite possibly is obviously the proliferation of indie games that are made for it, just because that's what's happening now. But I think that we may see a slight return of this idea of the AA game. These things that used to exist. There were a lot of games that maybe they were $10 cheaper than the big games you would buy, but they were a full-fledged, really polished game experience. And I think that you can spend $10 million on something, $20 million on something without the risk of going all in on the next Assassin's Creed being VR. You don't have to do that.
I think people underestimate the size of for example, the Steam PC gaming community.
Oh my God, it's
massive,
enormous.
And those are the obvious early adopters for VR.
Yeah. And the games that are so huge on Steam are games that are just a grain of sand to the console gamer. Things like Kentucky Route Zero and even the Telltale Game stuff. It's just there's a really solid foundation for smaller games, and those are going to be uniquely well suited, I think, to VR in general.
So Sundance just happened.
Yeah.
And I think, did you write an article?
I'm editing stuff.
Okay,
I have a couple
you guys had
there.
some articles about this, and apparently VR was one of the hot topics there.
Yeah. Well, it's all taking place for the most part within the New Frontiers program, which is kind of the more experimental thing. So I think there may be 7 things that were built for VR, everything from cardboard to Samsung to the DK2. And then, obviously, as we mentioned, the Oculus Story Studio announcement came out, and Chris Milk's announcement that he's working with Annapurna Pictures to this company, Verse, which is basically a distribution platform that he's making for VR filmmakers, and then he's got other prongs to that as well. And Annapurna is also working with Vice, and Vice News put together this really cool VR experience of being at the Millions March, the police brutality marches in NYC this past fall. They brought a setup there, and this is so dependent on people solving the live action capture, and there are a lot of ways that it can go wrong. I mean,
there's a lot of companies, like Jaunt is one, right?
Jaunt is one.
These cool 3D cameras.
Yep. Next VR is another. Samsung has already announced that they're going to have a kind of a camera capture tool for people. Some people are just making their own array of reds, kind of around a pole. Frame Store is exploring some really cool things they're doing with video, and so there are a lot of people in the space. But I think the way it's looking right now is a lot of that is just going to stay proprietary. I don't think we're going to find an all-in-one solution.
Do you think we'll see like a big investment from Hollywood?
Oh yeah, I think we already are. I mean, I think that every time a big developer tries it, they're blown away. I mean, from Alfonso Cuarón to Cronenberg, and like I said, that now that Pixar people are working on CGI movies with them, we're already seeing that. They've had people, Oculus has had, I'm going to forget his name while I'm on the spot, but they had a Hollywood liaison for about a year now, and those fruits are certainly paying off. What we saw very early was studios getting in to VR for ancillary marketing purposes. You had the Interstellar thing, you had the Game of Thrones thing, you had the Pacific Rim thing, and I think that the potential of those was borne out really quickly. I think now they're starting to crack those narrative questions that lead to an actual film experience.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks for having me in, Chris.